Let's head over into the DFS market. Listen, it is basically a weekly update here with all of this, but that is, again, this is some. Actually, Adam, this kind of dovetails into this too, right? If they ban college props from sports books, what about the DFS Plus operators? They're going to still put up the over/under stuff on what. So I mean, again, this all kind of ties together too. But what's the latest over in the DFS landscape?
So we'll just give you the state-by-state rundown of what we've seen recently. The most notable of the stories came yesterday when we learned that Massachusetts sent cease and desist letters to 10 fantasy sports operators who were offering some form of pick'em. Now, PrizePicks and Underdog were not part of that because, according to a spokesperson with the commission, there had been discussions between both of those companies and regulators to say that they would voluntarily make changes that would satisfy what the regulators want. And it looks like in Massachusetts that it's one of the states where they want it to be peer-to-peer versus player versus house. Now, some states have looked at it that way. Some states have said, no, anything that is pick'em is too close to a parlay, and you're not allowed to do that. So it's important that we draw a distinction as to what each state is doing with regard to that. Now, I think it's notable for a couple of reasons here in Massachusetts in particular, Matt. And let's talk about the 10 operators, right? You can go to the story that Mike Mazzio has at Legal Sports Report to find out who they are. But this is something that our old friend Dustin Gouker used to talk about all the time on the podcast. It's not just the big boys doing this, right? It's not just PrizePicks and Underdog. If anyone out there has thought, man, they talk a lot about these two companies. Well, they are the biggest in the space right now, but Sleeper and Better and, back in the day, Yahoo, who is on this list, P.S., like there are many operators who are doing some form of pick'em, and Massachusetts has called out a number of them in this case. We also see in Mississippi that Underdog has pulled out, and both of these states, Massachusetts and Mississippi, had telegraphed that there was some level of regulatory action potentially coming over the last few weeks. So neither was a particular surprise to see. Now, it's not just regulators cracking down. We are seeing some movement in terms of lawmakers in Georgia trying to codify some rules and maybe even some protections for the fantasy sports operators. There is a bill that was heard in committee that just yesterday we saw that the representative pushing it was trying to get into the game of skill definition. And, for those of us who've been listening to this a long time, you don't need us to go into skill versus chance and all of the things that get involved there. But I thought it was interesting that we see in Georgia that there is this bill. There are bills filed in Florida to this end as well. Kind of the natural next step, but I wonder if that next step is coming a little bit too soon because we haven't really even figured out what the issue is in every state. Can we agree on what the issue is before legislators try to codify what the issue is and is not? And I know that sounds like a little bit of word salad, but essentially what I said at the beginning here, different state regulators are taking issue with different parts of the pick'em offering. Like, I think we all probably need to get on the same page about, okay, in general, what is going to be something that is going to meet the definition state by state that is close to uniform for the sake of this thing not being a constant game of whack-a-mole for the next few years in terms of trying to figure out the legality of the product in different states. And Matt, as we talked about last week, this comes at the end of football season. No big surprise that that's the timing, right? That was the time for these companies to make money. But, of course, we saw it was before last football season that DraftKings, FanDuel et al. Began the push up in Wyoming where they said to regulators, hey, you might want to take a closer look at this. And then the regulators of their own volition said, yeah, this doesn't work. And it kind of started the cascade that we've talked about for the last 6 months here. We're not going to get to next football season and still be in the situation we're in right now. But again, as for now, we are still seeing state by state a lot of action coming down against the pick'em products.
Yeah, I wonder if we see some stuff like we saw with DraftKings and FanDuel back in the day, despite the fact that they were the biggest of competitors. When they were trying to get these DFS laws done in all of these states, they worked together to put together a framework and go in and have a unified front like you're talking about. I do wonder if we don't see PrizePicks and Underdog kind of working together behind the scenes here, right, to put together some sort of framework that they think is passable and presentable to all of these states that are, again, questioning the validity of the product that they're putting out, where despite the fact of them being the two biggest players in the market and despite the fact of them being competitors, hey, it's in our best interest for us us to come at this from a unified front.
And good thinking there, because there is the Coalition for Fantasy Sports where the couple of these companies have gotten together and are trying to present a unified front. But as we've talked about, different ambitions lead to different wants. And Underdog pulled its pick'em from North Carolina this past week. Why? They're in the process of applying for a sports betting license. They want to be there at launch, and for the first time, we would see what their sports betting product is like. And we've talked about on this podcast that they have ambitions in sports betting, so they had a different motivation in North Carolina to pull their product as part of the licensing process for sports betting. Prize Picks doesn't have that same motivation. So they're going to have to decide for themselves where they see the commonalities that they can push for, because there are going to be some states where they're not looking for the same thing.
Do you live in Alabama, Georgia, Illinois, Minnesota, or Missouri? Well, guess what? You are in luck, because we have little updates for you on each and every one of those states.
Oh, it's old school LSR pod with the state level whip around. Here I go. We'll start in Alabama, where, again, there is more legislative movement than we expected. We've already seen one chamber of passage, and what we're hoping for is to see the House get a move on it as well. We did have some folks talking in the Alabama House yesterday about how they think if the bill can get to the floor, that it will have a very good chance of passage. Now, can it get to the floor? We're going to find out. But Alabama is farther along in this than it has been in the past. Now, again, this is a larger project here because this would require a constitutional amendment, so it's going to need more votes. It also is a package that could include casino, that could include lottery, so we're waiting to see if it gets through with all three, if it somehow gets scaled back, if sports betting maybe gets pulled out and is treated differently. Wait and see when it comes to that in Alabama, but there was at least some discussion yesterday of what the prospects look like in the House. Now, in Georgia, we just talked a little bit about the DFS bill and its consideration there. Same thing, where we've seen one chamber of passage, and we are waiting for the House again in Georgia to make a move on sports betting. Is that going to happen? Don't know if it's going to happen, because we are again talking about larger issues in Georgia that are stalling out that sports betting bill. It is interesting to see DFS move a little bit, because we had been told that DFS might get caught up in the discussion over sports betting. What could be interesting there is that Prize Picks is based in Georgia, and there is at least a little bit of home state consideration there when it comes to one of the biggest operators in the DFS space. They, of course, gave their testimony in that committee hearing about why they think their product should be legalized and codified, and we're watching what happens there in Georgia. Illinois is a really interesting one, Matt. Governor Pritzker, who has been at times a help to the sports betting industry and at times a hindrance to the sports betting industry, in his budget is proposing more than doubling the tax rate on sports betting in Illinois, which would go up over 30%. And this is a state that, of course, got off to a weird start because of having the required in-person registration that was there to benefit Rush Street and Rivers. And the COVID pandemic put a wrench in that, and Pritzker had to put a temporary restriction on the registration in person and allow them to be able to register online. And once that genie was out of the bottle, you really couldn't go back, even though the registration requirement went back into place for a certain amount of time. But Illinois has become a top 5 sports betting state in terms of revenue, and if they are able to pass some sort of change in the tax rate, don't be surprised if others try to follow suit down the line. Now, states that are still trying to get something done include Minnesota and Missouri, as we mentioned. Committee hearing in Minnesota, we saw one of the preferred sports betting bills from the Democrat Farmer Labor Party move forward. That's still procedural at this point, not a real big progress moment, but we did want to mention that one of those bills is on the move. We're only 2 weeks into that session right now. The same issue is going to be there, whether the tribes and the tracks can get on the same page. Tracks want licenses. Tribes have offered them a revenue cut and not licenses. We'll see what happens ultimately there. Missouri, interesting that the ballot measure that DraftKings and FanDuel have put a couple $1 million behind did hit a milestone this week that is notable. The petition gatherers say they have 100,000 signatures to put sports betting on the ballot in Missouri this November. The numbers you need to know: 170,000 valid signatures need to be turned in by May. Now, when you talk about valid signatures, if you've ever been involved in the political game, you know that if you need 170,000 valid signatures, you do not turn in 170,000 signatures. They are aiming for 300,000 because when all of these are random sampled and you go back and say, okay, how many of these are actual people who are registered voters who are able to sign the petition and be counted, you know that every time that happens, there's going to be a certain percentage that is thrown out. So you always try to turn in well more than you actually need. They get that done by May. They qualified for the ballot in November. Missouri might finally be able to get around the legislative roadblock that Senator Denny Haskins has put up for the last couple of years and appears ready to do again this year.